Berlin in 1940 was a city of confidence. Wide boulevards, illuminated theaters, and the constant rhythm of marching boots gave the impression of a capital untouched by danger. Victories in Poland, France, and across Europe had convinced both leaders and ordinary citizens that the Reich was destined for greatness. The Luftwaffe, celebrated as the sharp spear of German power, controlled the skies over much of the continent. To its pilots and officers, there seemed little reason to fear an enemy thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. When reports began to circulate of a new American bomber, the reactions were dismissive. The Boeing B-17 was said to be large, slow, and heavily armed. Its designers called it the Flying Fortress, but to many in the Luftwaffe, the name sounded like a marketing joke rather than a military threat. Pilots in leather jackets and flight caps laughed over cigarettes, imagining how easily their Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs would cut such a machine to pieces. To them, the idea that this lumbering aircraft could challenge German air superiority was almost comical. Yet within only a few years, the skies over Europe told a different story. The same aircraft once ridiculed as a target would appear not in dozens but in hundreds. They would form massive formations stretching from horizon to horizon, each bristling with machine guns and guarded by ever-improving American fighters. Their bomb bays would open above factories, rail yards, and cities, delivering destruction with a precision and persistence that no one in Berlin had imagined possible. The flying coffin, as some had mocked it, became the very symbol of Allied industrial might and determination. And then came Berlin itself. Once considered beyond the reach of American air power, the city became a target. Explosions tore through neighborhoods, fires consumed blocks, and the myth of invulnerability shattered. The Luftwaffe, bled of fuel, aircraft, and pilots, found itself overwhelmed, forced into a defensive struggle it could not win. The laughter of 1940 was long gone, replaced by the grim silence of defeat. This story is more than the tale of a machine. It is about the young American crews who climbed into the fortress knowing that many would not return. It is about the German civilians who endured night after night of fear, waiting for the sound of sirens that meant the bombers were near. And it is about how arrogance turned to desperation, as an air force that once seemed untouchable discovered the cost of underestimating an enemy. If you want to explore these forgotten moments of history, if you want to understand how technology, courage, and sacrifice reshaped the fate of nations, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and join a community that keeps the lessons of the past alive. This is the story of the bomber they mocked, until it leveled half of Berlin. The story of the B-17 cannot begin with the bomber itself. It begins with the state of the world in the late 1930s, when the balance of power in the skies seemed fixed in Germany's favor. The Luftwaffe was young, bold, and lethal. Born in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, it had grown in secret through the 1920s and then openly under Hitler. By 1939, its squadrons had already carved a reputation in Spain, where the Condor Legion tested tactics and aircraft during the Spanish Civil War. Bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 showed Europe what a modern air force could do. For German citizens, the Luftwaffe represented modernity and invincibility. Across the Atlantic, the United States lived in a different rhythm. Isolationist sentiment ran strong. Many Americans believed Europe's wars were not their concern. Yet in the minds of military planners, a sobering question lingered. If conflict did come, how would America project power across oceans? Naval guns could only reach so far. Aircraft carriers were still proving themselves. Land-based aviation, however, offered the dream of striking at an enemy's heart from afar. That dream needed a new kind of aircraft. The U.S. Army Air Corps, still modest in size, placed its hopes in a radical design, a 4-engine heavy bomber built not simply to reach the front lines, but to deliver destruction deep inside enemy territory. Boeing's engineers in Seattle, ambitious and confident, answered that call. In 1935, they unveiled the Model 299, a prototype bristling with machine guns and powered by 4 Wright Cyclone engines. During its demonstration flight, observers noticed its defensive firepower. One journalist reportedly remarked that it seemed like a flying fortress. The name stuck. At first, the Army Air Corps could barely afford such a machine. Budgets were thin, and many within the military establishment doubted the practicality of such a large bomber. Why build something so expensive when smaller twin-engine planes could do the job? But to visionary officers, the logic was clear. If America was to deter aggressors, it needed a weapon that could carry war directly to the enemy's heart, bypassing fleets and front lines. Meanwhile in Europe, events moved with frightening speed. In 1939 Germany invaded Poland, and the Luftwaffe unleashed the terror of blitzkrieg. In France the following spring, Stuka dive bombers screamed down upon columns of soldiers, while Messerschmitts cut through defending fighters. By June 1940 France had fallen. Britain stood alone. To many in Berlin the war seemed nearly won. The Battle of Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940 showed the first cracks in the Luftwaffe's aura. Though German fighters and bombers inflicted devastation on British cities, they failed to crush the Royal Air Force. Radar, determined pilots, and the resilience of the British public turned what Hitler expected to be a swift victory into a costly stalemate. Still, even after this setback, German pilots carried an aura of superiority. They considered themselves the elite of the air. Against them, any new American bomber seemed doomed. It is important to understand why the Luftwaffe laughed at the B-17. German doctrine emphasized fast, aggressive tactical strikes. Their bombers were built to support ground offensives, not to level distant cities with heavy payloads. To them, the American idea of a high-altitude, self-defending bomber flying deep into enemy airspace without escorts seemed unrealistic. Could such a plane really survive? German pilots, hardened in combat, thought the answer obvious: no. And yet, across the Atlantic, the United States pressed ahead. In 1941, as war loomed, production of the B-17 began in earnest. Boeing could not build them fast enough alone. The Douglas and Lockheed Vega companies joined in, forming what became a vast network of factories that would soon turn out thousands of fortresses. Each carried up to 13 heavy machine guns. Each could haul nearly 4,000 pounds of bombs on long missions. They were slow compared to fighters, but their designers believed in the power of formation. Dozens, then hundreds of B-17s flying together could cover each other with interlocking fields of fire, turning the sky into a fortress wall. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it seemed at first that the Luftwaffe had regained its unstoppable momentum. But the campaign drained resources, consumed fuel, and wore down pilots. By December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. For the Luftwaffe, the idea of facing America's vast industry was unsettling, but many still believed the new enemy was inexperienced and technologically behind. They clung to the belief that German skill in the air would be enough to counter any American machine. It was here that the paradox began to form. The very qualities that made the B-17 laughable to the Luftwaffe, the size, the slowness, the reliance on defensive guns, would, in mass, become its greatest strengths. But in 1940 and 1941, that was still unseen. Berliners went about their lives. German pilots flew confident patrols. And the Americans, across the ocean, quietly prepared a storm that would one day reach the heart of the Reich. By the time the first B-17 squadrons arrived in Britain in 1942, the stage was set for one of the great tests of the air war. Could a bomber force, mocked as impractical, prove itself against the world's most feared air force? Could the flying fortress fulfill its promise, not only surviving in the skies of Europe, but carrying war all the way to Berlin? Those questions would soon be answered in fire. When the first groups of B-17s landed in Britain in the summer of 1942, they looked massive compared to the smaller British bombers already stationed there. Ground crews marveled at the size of the tail, the wide wings, the heavy armor. To many Allied soldiers watching from the airfields, the arrival of the fortress felt like the beginning of something new. But would it actually work against Germany? Could this bulky newcomer survive in skies dominated by the Luftwaffe? The American plan was bold. Instead of night raids like the Royal Air Force, which relied on darkness to shield its planes, the U.S. Army Air Forces insisted on daylight precision bombing. They believed their Norden bomb sight, an advanced optical device, could strike factories, rail lines, and oil plants with surgical accuracy from high altitude. But this meant flying straight into enemy airspace in broad daylight, where German fighters and flak batteries waited. Was it confidence or was it arrogance? Did the Americans underestimate the cost of such a strategy? The first raids gave answers, half encouraging, half terrifying. In August 1942, 12 B-17s attacked railway targets in occupied France. Their formations looked impressive, and for a moment it seemed the fortress might live up to its name. Yet these were small missions against relatively light defenses. What would happen when hundreds of German fighters swarmed them? Could the interlocking guns really keep attackers away? German intelligence officers initially scoffed. They noted the slow speed, the predictable altitude, and the tight formations. To them it was just target practice. Pilots even boasted that one Bf-109 could down a fortress with ease. But soon came the surprise. Some German fighters attacking head-on were torn apart by concentrated fire. Reports trickled back to Berlin of pilots caught in deadly crossfire. Was the flying fortress truly more dangerous than they had thought? Still, the losses on the American side grew quickly. In 1943, as raids pushed deeper into occupied Europe, entire formations were mauled. The missions over places like Regensburg and Schweinfurt became legendary for their brutality. On those raids, dozens of B-17s were shot down in a single day. The statistics were chilling. Sometimes nearly 25% of a force never returned. Crews that did make it back landed with shredded wings, engines on fire, or half their gunners killed. Could any air force sustain that kind of loss and keep flying? Was this daylight precision bombing strategy madness? For the men inside the fortresses, every mission was a gamble. Imagine sitting in the glass nose, staring down at a city below while tracers and cannon shells streaked past your cockpit. Imagine the deafening sound of engines mixed with the constant rattle of machine guns. The air smelled of cordite, oil, and fear. Some gunners swore they could feel the heat of enemy cannon shells as they passed by. How many of us, sitting safely today, can even imagine that kind of pressure? Would we have climbed back into the same aircraft after watching friends vanish in fireballs? German civilians too began noticing a shift. At first, American raids seemed like pinpricks compared to the mass destruction of the RAF's night bombings. But over time, the precision strikes hit factories, ball-bearing plants, and aircraft assembly lines. Suddenly, production numbers dipped. The once invincible German war machine began to show stress. Was the laughter of the Luftwaffe now mixed with unease? Did commanders begin to wonder if these bombers were more than just propaganda tools? One Luftwaffe officer admitted in his diary, "We laughed at them at first. Now I'm not so sure. They come back again and again like waves against the shore." His words reflected a reality German pilots could no longer ignore. Each time they destroyed a formation, new fortresses arrived days later. The American factories seemed endless. Was this not the real strength of the B-17? Not just the aircraft itself but the industrial giant that produced it by the thousands? And yet, American persistence came at a cost. Families back home received telegrams by the thousands. Missing in action. Killed in action. Mothers, wives, and children gathered in kitchens across the United States, reading the words they dreaded most. Could the strategy be justified, knowing how many lives were lost for each target struck? Was destroying one factory worth losing 10 bombers and 100 men? The clash between fortress and fighter grew into a deadly chess match. The Luftwaffe developed new tactics like head-on attacks to exploit the B-17's vulnerabilities. They mounted heavy cannons on their fighters, trying to punch through the bomber's armor. American crews responded by tightening formations, overlapping fields of fire, and inventing desperate measures, like flying damaged planes in the middle of the group so others could shield them. But how long could this brutal contest go on before one side collapsed? By the late summer of 1943, the Americans had learned a hard truth. The fortress was powerful but not invincible. Without long-range escorts, raids into the heart of Germany bled the bomber force white. Even as Berlin braced for the inevitable, the question remained hanging over every airfield in Britain. Could the flying fortress truly break the Reich, or would it break the men who flew it first? By late 1943, the air war over Europe had shifted into a brutal contest of attrition. The United States was sending more B-17s across the Atlantic every month. Airfields across England filled with the thunder of engines as fresh crews arrived, young men barely out of high school. They were told that the flying fortress could defend itself, that if they stuck together in formation they would stand a good chance of coming home. But after their first missions, many realized that survival was measured not in guarantees but in luck. Was the fortress truly a shield, or was it just a larger coffin waiting in the sky? The Luftwaffe, still proud, still dangerous, answered with ferocity. German fighter groups massed along expected bomber routes, ambushing formations with dozens of aircraft at a time. They attacked from the front, from above, from behind, using coordinated tactics honed through years of combat. Pilots bragged of punching holes straight through the bomber streams. Some units even experimented with desperate tactics, ramming bombers with their own aircraft when ammunition ran dry. Can you imagine the level of desperation it takes for a pilot to turn his fighter into a human missile? And yet, even as formations were torn apart, something unnerving unfolded for German commanders. The Americans kept coming. One day Regensburg, another day Schweinfurt, then Leipzig, Bremen and Hanover. Factories repairing tanks. Plants producing ball bearings. Rail yards carrying supplies to the Eastern Front. All became targets. Could the Luftwaffe stop an enemy that seemed willing to lose hundreds of planes just to cripple a single factory? Schweinfurt in particular became a symbol. The city's ball-bearing plants were vital to the German war machine. Without ball bearings, engines, tanks and aircraft alike would grind to a halt. The Americans knew this. Twice in 1943, they sent massed raids against the city. The cost was staggering, dozens of fortresses lost, entire crews wiped out, but production was badly disrupted. German industry scrambled to disperse factories and find substitutes. The lesson was clear. Even amid horrific losses, the B-17 could punch at the very heart of Germany's ability to fight. Was that not the very definition of strategic bombing? Berlin meanwhile waited. 4 years it had endured British raids at night, but Americans had not yet dared to send their bombers so deep in daylight. The city remained a symbol of defiance. Propaganda boasted that Berlin was safe, that no enemy aircraft could strike the capital in broad daylight. But ordinary Berliners wondered in silence. If the Americans could hit Hamburg and Schweinfurt, how long before they came here? And when they did, would the Luftwaffe still be strong enough to keep them away? German pilots were showing strain. By late 1943, losses mounted not only among aircraft but among veteran airmen. Replacements were younger, less experienced, and often had only a handful of hours in combat before being thrown against massed bomber formations. Wasn't this the same trap Germany's enemies had faced earlier in the war? Could skill alone outweigh sheer numbers, when American factories produced more aircraft each month than Germany could replace in a year? American crews also bore scars. Many completed missions with empty gun positions, their friends killed mid-flight. Bombardiers watched as flames engulfed planes beside them, knowing crews had no chance of bailing out. The promise of precision bombing sometimes felt hollow when flak and fighters forced premature drops, scattering bombs across cities. Did the men inside the fortresses wrestle with guilt, knowing their bombs often struck not only factories but also neighborhoods filled with civilians? And yet, could they ignore the orders, when every mission was framed as another step toward ending the war? In the skies, the clash of wills intensified. The fortress formations grew larger, sometimes filling the sky with hundreds of aircraft. German civilians standing in fields below described the sight as terrifying, an endless wall of silver that caught the sunlight and shimmered like a moving city in the air. How could any nation withstand that kind of pressure forever? By early 1944, the Americans had introduced something new, long-range escort fighters. The P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast and deadly, suddenly appeared above the formations. German pilots who once attacked bombers with relative impunity now faced hunters of their own. The balance began to tip. Luftwaffe commanders realized the nightmare before them. Not only did they have to fight the bombers, but also the escorts that chased them back to their own bases. Was this the moment the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed? The first daylight raids on Berlin came in March 1944. American commanders had debated the risk for months. Could the bombers survive that deep into enemy territory? Would Berliners finally see that the fortress could reach them in broad daylight? The answer came as silver specks appeared over the capital. Air raid sirens wailed. Civilians rushed to shelters. Above the city, fortresses opened their bomb bays. Explosions rolled across industrial districts. Fires rose into the sky. The unthinkable had happened. Berlin, the proud heart of the Reich, had been struck by daylight American bombers. German propaganda tried to spin the events, insisting damage was minimal, claiming that defenses were still strong. But Berliners knew otherwise. They had heard the bombs fall. They had seen the smoke. For the first time, the American air war no longer seemed like a distant threat. It was personal. Was this not the turning point when Berliners realized that even their capital was no longer safe? The Luftwaffe had laughed at the flying fortress. But by 1944, with Berlin itself under bombardment, the laughter was gone. What remained was a grim acknowledgement: the fortress in the sky had arrived and it was not leaving. The first American daylight raid on Berlin had been a symbolic strike, but it was only the beginning. As the months of 1944 unfolded, the attacks grew larger, more frequent, and more devastating. For Berliners, the sound of sirens became part of daily life. They hurried to shelters with children in tow, clutching whatever belongings they could carry. Above ground, entire neighborhoods braced for impact. Could any city, no matter how proud, endure the constant hammering of high explosives and firebombs? The Luftwaffe fought back with all it had. Fighter groups scrambled to intercept the bomber streams, but the odds were increasingly impossible. By now, American P-51 Mustangs escorted the B-17s almost the entire way to their targets. German pilots who once boasted of easy victories found themselves hunted. Many Luftwaffe aces, once symbols of invincibility, were shot down during desperate interceptions. How long could Germany bleed its best pilots before the air war became unwinnable? On the ground, Berlin was transforming. Once grand boulevards were reduced to rubble. Government ministries that had stood as symbols of Nazi power now lay shattered, their stone facades blackened by fire. Apartment blocks collapsed onto themselves, burying families in basements that had become tombs. Survivors emerged dazed, covered in dust, staring at a landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than the capital of a modern empire. Was this what Hitler's thousand-year Reich had come to, tenements and ministries reduced to ash in a matter of hours? For the men inside the fortresses, Berlin was both the ultimate target and the ultimate nightmare. Crews were told they were striking the enemy's nerve center. But they also knew what awaited them: thick walls of flak rising in black puffs through the clouds, streams of tracers from every direction, and the knowledge that each second over the target multiplied the chance of never returning. Did they comfort themselves by believing their bombs were hitting factories and rail lines, or did they wrestle in silence with the knowledge that civilians below could not escape the blast radius? The Luftwaffe tried new tactics: rocket-firing fighters, heavily armed Sturmgruppen, designed to smash through bomber boxes, even the use of experimental jet aircraft like the Me-262. But the numbers were relentless. For every fortress brought down, more arrived the next day. American production had reached a point where losses, though painful, no longer slowed the campaign. Could German industry, already straining under shortages of fuel and raw materials, possibly keep pace with such industrial might? By the summer of 1944, the raids became routine. Entire districts of Berlin were systematically leveled. Rail hubs, armaments factories, and oil storage tanks were hit again and again until they ceased to function. Yet the destruction did not stop at industry. Homes, hospitals, and schools were caught in the firestorms. Thousands of civilians died, many more were left homeless. How does a society keep faith in its leaders when the very ground beneath it crumbles daily? Did Berliners still believe the promises of Goebbels' propaganda, or had quiet despair taken root in every shelter and cellar? Even German soldiers returning from the Eastern Front were stunned at the sight of their capital. Men who had seen the battlefields of Russia could hardly recognize Berlin. Streets once filled with trams and laughter were now lined with wreckage and silence. Was it possible, they asked themselves, that the war was already lost, even as Hitler promised final victory? For the Allies, the raids were framed as necessary to break the backbone of German resistance. Each sortie was another brick in the strategy of attrition, wearing down the enemy until surrender became inevitable. But did the American crews truly feel victory each time they saw the city burning below, or did some wonder whether this was vengeance disguised as strategy? Could the human cost ever be fully justified? Inside Germany, the collapse of the Luftwaffe's control was evident. Fuel shortages grounded many training flights, leaving new pilots with only a fraction of the experience once required. Aircraft were produced but sat idle for lack of gasoline. The sight of fighters failing to rise in time to meet the bomber streams became more common. To Berliners watching the sky, the absence of their defenders was both a relief and a curse. Without fighters overhead, perhaps fewer dogfights rained debris on the city, but it also meant the bombers had free rein. Did civilians begin to resent the Luftwaffe itself, once hailed as Germany's guardian, now powerless to shield them? And still the fortress formations came. Day after day, the horizon filled with silver specks that grew into thundering giants. The ground shook as tons of explosives fell. Flames rose into the night sky, visible for miles. Each raid was followed by the grim work of pulling bodies from ruins, of carrying water to extinguish fires, of burying the dead in mass graves. Was the true weapon of the flying fortress not only its bombs, but the slow erosion of German morale? By late 1944, Berlin had become a scarred battlefield long before Soviet tanks ever reached its outskirts. The laughter of Luftwaffe pilots in 1940 was now a distant memory, buried under rubble and silence. The flying fortress had proven itself not just a machine of war, but a symbol of persistence, of industry, and of inevitability. The city at the heart of the Reich had learned the hard way that no fortress on the ground was strong enough to resist the fortress in the sky. By the end of 1944, the balance of power in the skies over Europe was beyond dispute. The Luftwaffe, once the spearhead of German dominance, had become a shadow of itself. Its best pilots were gone, killed, captured, or too exhausted to fly. Its training program, once rigorous, was now a desperate crash course. Young men who had logged only a handful of flight hours were sent into battle against seasoned American crews flying in tight defensive formations. Was this not the cruelest irony, that the mighty air armada which once terrorized Europe was now throwing boys into cockpits, asking them to hold back a tidal wave? The statistics told a grim story. German aircraft production in 1944 actually peaked in raw numbers. But what good were machines without fuel or pilots to fly them? American raids on synthetic oil plants cut into the very bloodstream of the Luftwaffe. Fighters sat idle on airfields, unable to take off. Commanders begged for more fuel, but the tankers never came. Could an air force survive when its lifeblood had been strangled? For the crews of the flying fortresses, the change was visible. Missions that once meant vicious combat now often saw only scattered resistance. Flak still filled the skies, but the swarms of German fighters were fewer, more desperate, and less coordinated. American gunners, once braced for wave after wave of interceptors, sometimes returned with little to report. Did they dare to hope the end was near, or did they fear it was just the calm before a final storm? Meanwhile, Berlin endured its darkest months. With each raid, more of the city vanished. Iconic landmarks were gutted. The Reich Chancellery itself was damaged. Factories that had once fueled Hitler's war machine were smashed into twisted steel and smoking craters. But it wasn't only industry that disappeared. Whole neighborhoods ceased to exist, their names remembered only by survivors who stumbled out of cellars into landscapes so altered they no longer recognized their own streets. How many times can a city be destroyed before its soul breaks? Inside shelters, the mood shifted. At first, Berliners had clung to the idea that their leaders had everything under control, that German science or new wonder weapons would turn the tide. But as the raids continued, whispers grew louder. Where is the Luftwaffe? Why are we left defenseless? Propaganda broadcasts still spoke of imminent victory, but the silence in the skies told another story. Did people begin to realize that the war they had been promised to win was, in truth, already lost? The Luftwaffe tried one last gamble. The new Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, sliced through bomber formations with unprecedented speed. For a moment, hope flickered. American crews reported the terrifying streaks of jets blasting past them. But there were too few too late. Hitler himself had delayed the jets' proper deployment, insisting they be used as bombers instead of fighters. Even when they were used correctly, they lacked fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. Could a handful of jets reverse a flood of thousands of Allied aircraft? By early 1945, the Americans were flying missions into Berlin almost at will. The once proud capital had become a ruin. Food was scarce, water lines shattered, and transportation crippled. Refugees from the east poured into the city, fleeing the Soviet advance, only to find themselves caught in firestorms from the west. For ordinary people, survival became a daily calculation. Risk the shelters and suffocate underground, or risk the streets and die in the open. What choice was there when both roads led to despair? The B-17, once mocked as slow and clumsy, now symbolized inevitability. Its persistence wore down the very idea of resistance. Crews who once flew with dread now carried with them the knowledge that their missions, though costly, were breaking the enemy's will. Yet even among these men, questions lingered. When they looked down and saw flames spreading across the city, did they feel triumph, or unease? Was victory worth the sight of children weeping beside the ruins of their homes? The Germans, too, wrestled with questions. Officers who had laughed at American bombers in 1940 now watched as those same bombers dismantled the Reich piece by piece. Did they think back to those early years, to the mockery and arrogance, and wonder how it had all gone so wrong? Or did they refuse to think at all, focusing only on survival in a collapsing world? By March 1945, Berlin was barely functioning. Transportation was paralyzed. Factories lay silent. The once mighty Luftwaffe was reduced to scattered flights, often forced to retreat without engaging. The American bombing campaign had done more than drop explosives. It had torn away the illusion of invincibility. And so, as the Red Army prepared its assault from the east, the city already lay broken, softened by months of bombardment. Was it the Soviets who captured Berlin, or the flying fortresses who first leveled its defenses? And yet, amidst the devastation humanity endured, people shared bread and shelters. Firefighters risked their lives to drag survivors from rubble. Priests offered words of comfort as bombs shook the ground above. Even in the heart of destruction, life clung on. Perhaps that, too, was a kind of fortress, not made of steel and rivets but of resilience. By the spring of 1945, the laughter that once echoed in Luftwaffe mess halls was gone. In its place was silence, broken only by the distant thunder of Allied bombers crossing the sky. Those same B-17s that had been dismissed as lumbering, vulnerable machines now flew in endless streams, blotting out the sun above Berlin. The Luftwaffe, once so confident, was reduced to fragments. Squadrons scattered, fuel tanks empty, pilots exhausted beyond recovery. What had once been a predator was now prey, and even that was vanishing. Berlin had become unrecognizable. The proud avenues and monuments of the capital were buried under rubble. Once grand neighborhoods were nothing more than piles of brick, where survivors picked through the ruins for food, water, or scraps of clothing. Each raid deepened the sense of hopelessness. People asked themselves, would they be killed by the bombs or would they live long enough to see Soviet artillery flatten what the Americans had spared? Was there even a future left to hope for? Inside the cockpits of the flying fortresses, the missions had taken on a surreal quality. The airmen no longer faced swarms of interceptors. Flak still rose in black bursts, but fewer and fewer shells reached their altitude. Sometimes they dropped their bombs without seeing a single German fighter. Could this truly be the same airspace where, just a year earlier, dozens of fortresses might fall in flames during a single raid? The shift was so complete, so total, that even the veterans were left shaking their heads. Berliners who once believed in Hitler's promises now whispered doubts in the shelters. Where is the Luftwaffe? Why do they not come? The propaganda machine churned out tales of secret weapons, of victory still within reach. But the rumble of American bombers overhead told another story. Day after day, the people felt abandoned by the very force that was supposed to protect them. Did the silence of the Luftwaffe wound deeper than the bombs themselves? The American crews carried with them a dual weight. On one hand, pride, knowing they were part of a campaign that would end the war, destroy the Nazi war machine, and bring their comrades closer to victory. On the other hand, unease. As they looked down at the flames engulfing Berlin, could they fully silence the thought of the thousands of civilians below? Was the price of breaking an empire worth the suffering of its people? These were questions that lingered long after the bomb doors closed. The Luftwaffe's last moments of defiance were pitiful compared to its former glory. A few jets streaked through the formations, firing bursts before disappearing into the clouds. Some desperate pilots launched suicide rams, smashing their crippled fighters into bombers in a final act of fury. But these gestures changed nothing. They were not battles. They were convulsions, the spasms of an air force that had bled itself dry. Could a machine of war truly die with dignity, or was its collapse always destined to be chaotic and tragic? By April, the Soviet armies were at the gates of Berlin. Yet the Americans still came. Day after day, the B-17s flew missions against the already ruined city. Warehouses, depots, and train yards were obliterated. Some wondered if there was anything left worth destroying. But the bombers flew anyway, hammering the last vestiges of German logistics. For the crews, it was a grim duty, to keep pressure on until the final surrender. For the people below, it was torment without end. How many times could the same city burn before nothing remained but ashes? In the wreckage, stories emerged of ordinary Berliners clinging to survival. Families huddled in half-collapsed basements, rationing crusts of bread. Children carried buckets of water from shattered mains, weaving between piles of rubble. Old men stood on rooftops with buckets of sand, trying to extinguish flames as bomb after bomb fell. Even in the heart of destruction, there was stubborn defiance, a refusal to let the city's last breath be stolen without resistance. Was this courage or simply desperation refusing to let go? The B-17 flying fortress had become more than just a bomber. To its crews, it was a shield, a machine that brought them home against impossible odds. To the German people, it was a specter, an unshakable presence in the skies that no one could stop. To history, it became a symbol of industrial will, of persistence, of a war strategy that relied not on speed or glamour but on relentless endurance. And perhaps that was the cruelest twist of all. The Luftwaffe had mocked the fortress as slow, heavy, even clumsy. Yet it was precisely those qualities, its armor, its firepower, its sheer capacity, that made it indestructible in the long run. Who then had the last laugh? By the time the Red Army stormed into Berlin in late April, much of the city was already gone. Soviet shells finished what American bombs had begun. The Luftwaffe's few remaining aircraft sat abandoned on runways, their wings cannibalized for parts, their cockpits empty. In the skies where once mighty squadrons had roared, there was only silence. The war had shifted entirely to the ground, but its outcome had been decided long before the Soviets raised their flag over the Reichstag. It was decided when the laughter of the Luftwaffe gave way to despair, and when the slow, stubborn fortresses refused to be broken. And so, the story of Berlin's devastation was not only a tale of bombs and rubble. It was a parable of arrogance and underestimation. The Luftwaffe had believed itself superior, and for a time it was. But the fortress in the sky was not a weapon of brilliance, it was a weapon of will. A weapon that turned laughter into silence, confidence into collapse, and a capital city into ruins. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Berlin lay in ruins. The streets once filled with music, parades, and shouts of confidence were now choked with dust and silence. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to heaps of stone. The river Spree flowed past neighborhoods that no longer existed. The smell of smoke and ash lingered in the air long after the last bombs had fallen. Could a city so thoroughly destroyed ever rise again? For the survivors, life became a daily struggle not for victory, but for existence. Food was scarce, water unreliable, and shelter often meant little more than a roof patched with boards and tar. Families were broken, many grieving the loss of loved ones buried beneath rubble or lost to the firestorms. And yet, somehow, Berlin endured. Mothers found ways to feed children with scraps, priests gathered congregations in the open air, and neighbors rebuilt walls with their bare hands. Out of devastation, the seed of resilience began to grow. Was this not humanity's oldest story, that even in the darkest night, people look for a dawn? The B-17 flying fortress had played a central role in bringing Berlin to this point. Its crews remembered their missions not only as feats of endurance, but also as trials of conscience. They had been told their bombs shortened the war, and perhaps they had. But they also knew those bombs had fallen on civilians, on homes, on children. Could they reconcile duty with the haunting images of burning cities below? Many veterans wrestled with that question for the rest of their lives. For the Germans, the lessons were bitter. The Luftwaffe's early arrogance, the laughter at American bombers, the confidence that their fighters would always dominate, proved fatal. Underestimation of an enemy can be as deadly as overconfidence in oneself. The fortress was never designed to dazzle with speed or elegance. It was built to endure, to carry on no matter the opposition. In the end, that endurance proved decisive. Shouldn't this have been the warning for every generation? Never dismiss persistence, never mock resilience, never underestimate what looks ordinary? The Allies too learned lessons. Strategic bombing had broken Germany's industry, crippled its transport, and forced the Luftwaffe into collapse. Yet it also left deep scars, both physical and moral. Could there have been another way? Some historians argue the bombings hastened the end of the war and saved countless lives that would have been lost in prolonged combat. Others question whether entire cities had to be leveled to achieve that goal. The debate still stirs today. What is the balance between military necessity and human cost? In Berlin, rebuilding was slow. The post-war years saw the city divided, east and west separated by politics, ideology, and later by a wall of concrete. But even in division, the spirit of Berlin did not die. Brick by brick, street by street, the city returned to life. Children once again played in parks. Music returned to concert halls. Cafes opened their doors. Was it not remarkable that from such complete destruction, a new city, a new identity could rise? The B-17 itself became a legend. To Americans, it symbolized the industrial might and determination that carried the nation to victory. To veterans, it was remembered as the fortress that brought them home through storms of fire. To Germans, it was remembered with dread, a machine that spelled the death of their capital. And to historians, it remains one of the defining icons of the Second World War. Proof that in war, persistence can be more powerful than brilliance. The laughter of the Luftwaffe in 1940 now seems like a tragic echo. It was laughter rooted in overconfidence, in the belief that nothing could challenge their supremacy. Yet history showed otherwise. The very machine they mocked would be the one that undid them. How many times in human history has arrogance blinded nations to the dangers of underestimation? And how often has resilience, slow, steady, unyielding, turned the tide? Today Berlin stands rebuilt, vibrant and alive. Tourists walk the streets where bomb craters once gaped. Children laugh in playgrounds where rubble once smoldered. Monuments and memorials remind the living of what was lost, and why it must never be repeated. The sound of bombers no longer echoes overhead. Instead, the hum of trains and the chatter of markets fill the air. Isn't this the truest victory, that life, despite all, goes on? The story of the B-17 in Berlin is not just about machines and cities. It is about people. The pilots who flew missions with courage and fear. The civilians who huddled in shelters, praying the walls would hold. The children who grew up in ruins, yet lived to see their city reborn. The laughter of arrogance that turned into silence. And the fortress in the sky that, against all odds, fulfilled its grim mission. And so we are left with questions. What does it mean to win a war? Is victory measured in rubble and ashes, or in the lessons that rise from them? Was Berlin's destruction the price of freedom, or the warning of what happens when nations allow tyranny to reign unchecked? Each listener must answer for themselves. But perhaps one truth stands above the rest, that resilience, whether in steel or in spirit, always outlasts arrogance. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. In Berlin, silence finally replaced the endless roar of engines and the crash of falling bombs. The city was broken, divided, and haunted, but it was alive. From the ruins, a new world would emerge. And yet, the story of how the Luftwaffe once laughed at the B-17 flying fortress, only to watch it level half of Berlin, lingers like an echo. What can we learn from that story? That arrogance blinds and endurance wins. The Germans believed their fighters would always dominate, that the fortress was too slow, too heavy, too vulnerable. But they underestimated not just a machine, but the will of a nation that could build thousands of them, train tens of thousands of men, and keep flying despite losses that would have broken lesser powers. Isn't this a reminder that resilience, multiplied by industry and determination, becomes unstoppable? The B-17 became more than a bomber. It was a floating symbol of inevitability. Crews trusted it with their lives. Families back home prayed for it to bring their sons safely across the ocean of flak and fighters. Berliners dreaded the shape of its wings against the sky, knowing that wherever it appeared, destruction followed. Can one aircraft hold such different meanings depending on which side of the bombs you stood? For the Luftwaffe, the laughter turned into silence. The once proud air force that had terrorized Europe in the Blitz was itself ground down by attrition, fuel shortages, and the sheer persistence of the fortress. Its last jets and desperate pilots could not alter the outcome. What does that tell us? That even brilliance cannot withstand exhaustion, and that overconfidence often builds the stage for collapse. Berlin's fate carried lessons that stretch beyond the war. A city can be destroyed but not erased. A people can be broken but not permanently silenced. Berlin rose again, divided and scarred, yet determined. Today, its streets bustle with life, its monuments stand as reminders, and its story warns every generation that arrogance invites downfall. When we walk through Berlin today, do we hear the faint echoes of bombers overhead, or the laughter that once dismissed them? The B-17's legacy is carried not only in museums and memorials, but in the memories of those who flew, fought, and endured. Veterans remembered the cold, the fear, the sight of flames erupting from comrades' aircraft. Survivors on the ground remembered the firestorms, the collapsed buildings, the desperate race to find water before flames consumed everything. These stories, painful though they are, must be told. If we forget them, do we not risk repeating them? And yet, there is something deeply human at the heart of this history. The fortress was steel, but it symbolized persistence. The Luftwaffe was powerful, but it symbolized arrogance. Berlin was reduced to ash, but it symbolized resilience. These three threats, persistence, arrogance, resilience, are woven into the story of the war and into the lessons it still teaches us today. Which of these threads do we carry forward in our own time? As we close this story, imagine for a moment a Berlin night in 1945. The fires have gone out. The city is quiet, broken. Above, the skies are empty. Somewhere in that silence, the echo of laughter remains, but it is not victorious. It is the hollow laughter of a force that thought itself invincible, undone by the very enemy it mocked. So, dear listener, what do you think? Was the destruction of Berlin a grim necessity to break the Nazi war machine, or a tragedy that shows the limits of strategic bombing? Did the B-17 prove itself as the weapon that ended the war faster, or as a reminder that endurance comes with a human cost too heavy to bear? Share your thoughts, because history lives when we discuss it, question it, and learn from it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, of machines, men, and moments that shaped the 20th century, make sure you stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and join the community that keeps history alive, one story at a time. Because in the end, history is not just about the past. It is about us, what we choose to remember, and what lessons we carry forward. And perhaps the greatest lesson of the fortress over Berlin is this: laughter fades, arrogance crumbles, but resilience endures.